All right, guys, we have a special treat here today. We're joined by a person I'm personally a big fan of. I know Doug is a longtime friends with, Richard Maybury. Richard publishes a newsletter called the Early Warning Report, and we'll link to that in the description of this video. But he also publishes a series of books called the Uncle Eric books, which I'm a big fan of, and certainly helped open my kids' eyes to the ideas of liberty and what the ideas the country was based on. So anyway, Rick, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you being here.
Oh, I've been looking forward to it. It's a great opportunity, and I appreciate it. Incidentally, I want to congratulate you two gentlemen. I mean, the work you do is so important. People absolutely need to hear some alternative to the mainstream socialist nonsense that's pumped out constantly. So, you are really doing a job that is essential, and I thank you personally for doing that.
Well, thanks, Rick. I really appreciate that. But I feel like a salmon swimming upstream because it seems like the tide of history is turning against us. And do you think am I justified in being pessimistic about the way things are going or not? I mean, what's your view?
The way things are going, I think civilization is in decline because the fundamental ethical principles that make civilization possible have been almost totally forgotten, not only in the United States, but around the world. As you know, I occasionally write about those two principles that make civilization possible. There's only 17 words to them. The first one is do all you have agreed to do, and the other one is do not encroach on other persons or their property. And those 17 words make civilization possible. They are the behaviors that I believe are in our DNA. They are the behaviors that work for humans. In the same way that running works for a fox and swimming works for a fish, flying works for a bird, there are behaviors. The higher animals all have behaviors that work for them, and they have a choice. They can not follow those behaviors, but they aren't going to prosper, and they might die. Humans are the same. We've got these 17 words, I think, in our DNA, and you better follow them. And you can test this scientifically if you want. This is a really fun thing I like to hit people with. You can prove that those 17 words are correct by experimenting with them. Every chance you get, violate them and see. See what happens. Do it for a week and see what happens. Does your life get better or does your life get worse? So you can test them, you can prove them yourself. And what happened is, boy, this is really an abbreviated presentation here. But back in the Roman Empire days, and in other places, not just Rome, but in other places, people were stumbling on to the idea that legal systems should be built around those two principles, those 17 words. And by, let's say, the Middle Ages in England, there was a very highly developed legal system based on those 17 words. And that eventually gave rise to the Industrial Revolution and the civilization we have today, which is so much better than anything that has come before. Well, in America, in the 1600s and 1700s, people started leaving England and coming to America to escape their government because it was more and more encroaching on them, as we're seeing today. And they came here, and almost the total legal system of America in those days was based on those 17 words. Do all you have agreed to do, and do not encroach on other persons or their property. A whole body of case law was built up for over many, many centuries and was established in the United States. And eventually the government in England decided to get control of America And that's how the revolution broke out. The people started fighting. And they came up with, afterwards, a very imperfect, but, a very, very highly developed new form that came to be known as the system of liberty, which is based on those 17 words. Well, what happened there is that America began to prosper tremendously, and people around the world saw it. They said, wow, we'd like to have that too. So the principles of the American Revolution began to spread around the world. And that was progressing very nicely up until the late 1800s when socialism came in. And socialism just killed the movement. And that's essentially where we are today, is we're living under this increasing amount of socialism, which requires that the government own and control everything and everybody. And so all of civilization, in my opinion, is going downhill because we have abandoned the system of liberty. It is no longer taught in the schools. The only people who are learning it, as you incidentally, Doug, pointed out in your recent article there about homeschooling, the only people that are learning the system of liberty are the ones in homeschooling now, because the government-controlled schools and colleges sure aren't going to teach it. And it's been totally lost, but it's being rediscovered, and my Uncle Eric books are a big catalyst in that. We've sold, I think, 691,000 of them, and they are very well established in the homeschooling movement. So people who are raising their kids themselves are not all of them, certainly. I wish it was all of them. But, the movement is spreading. The system of liberty is being rediscovered. I'll stop there and let you guys say something.
That was a perfect précis that you just gave us.
Well, thank you.
It really is. But, I often point out that the primitive people, when they count, say 2, 3, and many is what comes after 3. So 17 words, okay, that's good because it's just 2 rules, so it's comprehensible. But I've been trying to bring just like physicists are trying to bring the way nature operates just down to 1 rule. And what do you think about, the 10 Commandments? I can't remember them, quite frankly. It's just too many under the 2, 3 many rule. And I'm a huge fan of the 2 great laws, but how about this for 1 great law? Do as thou wilt, but be prepared to accept the consequences. Does it amount to the same thing, or you think, or I'm missing something? I take a gloomy view of human nature, a rather cynical, dark view of human nature. So that's perhaps why I've brought those 2 great laws down to that, what I call the 1 great law. But do you think I'm missing something there?
Well, no, I don't. I think you and I are just on different tracks of the same railroad here. What I am after is a foundation for people to think legally in their lives, according to the natural law that's in our DNA. And so I want to see judges beginning to develop case law again based on those 17 words. So I try to make those 17 words, I did back in the 80s is when I developed them. Every word of those 17 words does some kind of special work, and it was chosen very, very carefully. Now, your principle there, I think, is a very good principle for daily life. Just generally making your decisions about what you're going to do in your relationships with other people. That's fine, and that's a good thing. I don't think there's a contradiction between your approach and my approach. It's just that I'm trying to be more legalistic than you are, because I think the legal system is horribly corrupt. The politicians have just destroyed it. Law now is no longer a shield, it's a sword. And I want to go back to making it a shield.
Good point. Good point.
When did that change? When did the legal system go from being a shield to a sword?
It wasn't all at once. What you have to understand about socialism is that it is based on, believe it or not, on a fascist premise, which is that all truth is just a matter of opinion, which means right and wrong are just matters of opinion. And so power holders should do whatever appears necessary. No exceptions, no limits. That's fascism. And the socialists have adopted that. So you have a case where they have the ability now, and they teach this in the schools and colleges, that the government should do anything, just whatever. If somebody points to something they regard as a problem, the government should do something about it. As if, and kids are left with this impression when they get out of school. They're left with the impression that the government is some superhero. It's some saint or angel with special powers that can solve problems, and that they should write their congressman and make sure that their congressman knows what they want, whatever problem they want solved. That's an exercise that's done in the schools all the time. Is write, the kids are taught to write your congressman and tell him what you want. So we've got this unlimited government that's growing by leaps and bounds to the point where now very few people question the idea that the government should simply do whatever anybody wants, and that gives it total power to do anything it wants with you and me.
Well, we know where this is going to end or should end, but maybe there will be a change in trend, although the trend is accelerating. But how do you read things? How long is this trend going to continue accelerating? And when do you think it'll turn around, time-wise or event-wise? Do you have any feelings about that?
I'll tell you, Doug. I'm going to make a public confession here now. Back in early 70s, I can remember, I was reading Reason magazine, and there was somebody on there, or somebody being interviewed or wrote an article, and it might have been you, that said that we're asking that same question, and put out the idea that, yeah, well, it looks like things are going to fall apart right now in the 1970s, but free markets are very, very creative, and they will find ways to adapt for a long time, and maybe as much as 20 years. I can remember writing into Reason, a letter to the editor saying, that's crazy, 20 years? Oh, no way. It's a few years maybe, but not 20 years. It's going to fall apart before then. Well, here we are. It still hasn't fallen apart. So that's one of the worst predictions I ever made. So I don't.
That's why they say if you're going to predict often, so we can when we're right. But
that's right.
But one prediction that you made, and you've made this a lot. The class of stocks that you've emphasized buying most, and you've been totally right on this, are the so-called defense contractors, because they've been in a huge secular bull market for just years, and for the reasons that I think you correctly identified. Now, how long is that going to continue, though? You have a feeling on that?
I can't see an end to it, and I can give you one statistic that all of my analysis really was based on for the last 30 years of being right about these stocks. There's just one statistic, and that is that since the year 3600 BC, governments have fought more than 14,000 wars against each other. So, when I came across that statistic, I thought, well, now, what's the chances they're going to stop? Probably pretty close to zero. So I'm still sticking to that prediction, because that's inherent in the nature of governments. Governments hate each other. They're like a bunch of street gangs. In fact, that's all they are, is they're just big street gangs with missiles. And they're fighting with each other all the time. Even when there's no reason to fight, they will find the reasons to hate each other. And so as long as governments hate each other, the defense industry is going to look pretty good.
Okay, it makes a lot of sense. I buy that argument, frankly. Although, everybody's got to have their own area of specialty, and I believe it's increasingly hard, becoming impossible, perhaps, to invest in the market, because to invest you need a certain amount of predictability, and investing is the process of planting a seed of corn so you can get an ear later. But so I've actually been much more partial to speculating, which is attempting to capitalize on distortions that the government causes in the market. But when Matt and I do this show, we kind of amaze each other at how gloomy everything looks like it's going to fall apart. And of course, it's looked that way for years, as you pointed out. But let's forget about the defense contractors, which are a destructive industry. But how long do you think, what do you feel about the stock market? What do you feel about the bond markets, for instance?
Oh, well, I'm sorry. I agree with everything you said. One of the really hard things that I've finally accepted, I did maybe, 15, 20 years ago, is that, while you and I believe in Austrian economics, which has a free market orientation, it's not very good for investing. And you need something that really understands or tries to understand the behavior of crowds, because that's what we're talking about here is markets now that are driven tremendously by emotion. And so I have fallen back on, I shouldn't say fallen back, but I've adopted the belief that technical analysis is really got to be the main tool that you use in your investing. The economics is really good. The fundamental analysis, that's all important. And Austrians tend to be real big on fundamental analysis. But I think that things are changing so fast that the big broad view that the Austrian economics gives you is just not enough. And you've got to use technical analysis, and you've got to have some genius stockbroker looking at the screen for you all day long using good technical analysis.
Well, I'd have to agree. Trends in motion do tend to stay in motion until they stop for some reason. And then you can see what's going to happen. So I like looking at charts just because they give me perspective of where something's been relative to the past and relative to other things. And that's important. It's a great navigation tool. But, I'm afraid that the economy and the markets are about to go over a cliff, go over a waterfall. And as we get into the Greater Depression, I'm afraid that since people have been, as you pointed out, so oriented towards the government that the government will fix everything, not only can, but should fix everything, that a strong man is going to come up and say, look, you got to give me power to straighten things out. Things are so bad. So what are the chances of that, things getting really bad in this country?
I think it's very plausible. I think, in fact, a high probability. What you're saying there. I can't really argue against it. A kind of a likely scenario I've had in my mind for a couple of decades is that we're going to very much follow what happened in Cuba back when Castro took over. the Cuban government was terribly corrupt. It was, and also terribly stupid, which governments tend to be. And the people were getting more and more angry. Finally, you had well, I should back up a little bit and say, if you look at the official histories of this, what you see is this revolution is developing, and Castro comes in, and the people rally around him, and he takes over and gets control of Cuba. Well, that's an oversimplification. What really happened was that there were guerrilla movements springing up all over Cuba. It wasn't just Castro's group leading the revolution. There was probably dozens of revolutions brewing in all over Cuba, and they all started rising up together at the same time. And the Cuban government realized, Batista realized, the jig's up. You're in trouble. Better get out of Dodge. So he and a bunch of his buddies and a whole lot of, essentially the government's treasury, got on a plane and they disappeared. And so, what happened after that was word got around. My gosh, the palace is empty. The presidential palace is empty. The government is gone. And then all of these different guerrilla leaders, of which Castro was just one, they all jump in their Jeeps and they start driving like crazy toward Havana to try to get to the presidential palace. And Castro had the fastest Jeep. So that's how he took over. And I'm thinking something like that is going to happen in the United States. The day will come when the president and Congress and the Supreme Court and all the bureaucracy is going to realize it's over with, man. We're going to be hanging from lampposts if we don't get out of here. And they'll just leave, and all these buildings in Washington will be empty, and then whoever gets there first is going to be the president.
That's a very interesting scenario, and I like the way you tell that story of Cuba. That's is there one particular book that gives that take on the revolution that you can name?
No, I got that when I was in college. I was taking a history course, a Latin American history course, and the professor, who was an expert on Latin America, said, don't listen to the official history of what happened in Cuba. Here's what really happened. Castro had the fastest Jeep.
I'm sure that professor would be ostracized and canceled if he was to say that today.
Oh, probably so, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Rick, in your most recent newsletter, you talked about the idea that basically that a depression is unavoidable in the future, is the way that what my takeaway was, and a big part of that was that the debt of all nations over thousands of years basically is totals like 18 trillion, and yet something like 11 trillion will be added by the end of this year. Is that, I don't know if I have my numbers right, but can you kind of explain what your thinking was behind that?
Let's see. I've got the newsletter in front of me. Let's see. It took thousands of years for governments to increase the world money supply to 18 trillion, and it's only taken 20 months to add another 11 trillion. And you can see from that, the inflation has started. I was looking at a chart yesterday of home prices, and it's fascinating. Home prices, the line traces almost exactly the increase in the money supply over the last 18 months. It's astounding. So you know where all that money's been going. And I think, as far as the article is concerned, it's about malinvestment, which almost nobody talks about. Let's see, what can we do? When the government injects money into the economy, the money does not descend in a uniform blanket. Some people get a lot, others get less, some people get none at all. And the areas where the money goes become hotspots, and businesses move into those hotspots to take advantage of those flows of money. Now, they don't really know what's going on. They don't know why a hotspot is hot, really. They just know that's where the money is, so that's where we're going to go. And they build plant and equipment there. They buy buildings, and they put machinery in them, and hire employees and everything. And so they are pulling capital in the direction of these hotspots. Well, the government continues increasing the money supply, and eventually prices are going up because the value of the money is going down, and the population's getting mad. So the Federal Reserve, which prints the money, slams on the brakes, and suddenly the flow of money to these hotspots either slows or stops. And those businesses are sitting there, and they're in the red, and they are staying in the red until somebody starts printing money again. And then that business that should not have been created there, that would not have been created if the counterfeiting of the money wasn't going on, that business is going under, and the government panics and starts printing more money again to revive the business. And some of that money goes into other locations. So you have a whole new group of hotspots out there that are created. That's the business cycle, the boom and bust business cycle. And each one of those cycles creates a new layer of this malinvestment. Businesses that are responding to the flows of money in the hotspots are not investment, they are malinvestment. And each time we go through one of these cycles, then there's another layer of malinvestment that's created. And since World War II, that means we've got 11 layers of malinvestment out there now that need to be shaken out. They should not exist, and they wouldn't exist if the government hadn't been inflating the money supply. So we're in this situation where the size of the shakeout that needs to happen to get rid of the malinvestment is, who knows how big it is, but it is really huge. So the depression, the shakeout that's necessary to do all these corrections has got to be colossal. But what I point out in that article in Early Warning Report is that it doesn't really have to be anything as catastrophic as the Great Depression. The reason the Great Depression was the Great Depression is because Roosevelt and his cronies wouldn't let it end. They kept interfering with the shakeout process. The liquidations that had to occur weren't allowed to occur because these guys kept trying to stop them, and it dragged out for 10 years. So, if the government would just stop printing the money and let the shakeout happen and stay away from it, don't touch it, let the process occur, I think that it's a very plausible thing that it would only last maybe 6 months or so. It would be nasty for 6 months. There's no doubt about that. But I think it would only take about 6 months, and it would be over with. And then as long as they didn't print any more money, then you would have a much, much more healthy economy without the boom and bust cycle.
I certainly agree with that overview, except I'm afraid that that's the rosy scenario. And, because, no government is going to want to have it happen on my watch, because they would go down as, everybody would call them the next Hoover. So they'll keep printing. And as you pointed out, the distortions cranked into the economy are much greater than they were before the last depression. So I think what's coming up is going to be the Greater Depression. And worse than that, just like the last depression featured World War II, I'm afraid that something resembling World War III, which is going to be very different from World War II. And this may be the only flaw, incidentally, that I see with the defense stocks, is that I think World War III is going to be so different from World War II that it's going to take outfits like General Dynamics and Lockheed completely by surprise. I think it's going to be a bio war and a cyber war, both. What do you think?
Yeah, I can't disagree with you, and definitely I would say that you're right that that's the direction things are going. A greater depression than the Great Depression, and also very possibly a worse war than World War II, which is a horrible thing to think about. But I've often thought, if somebody elected me president, what would I do?
Ooh,
And
scary.
my first reaction would be I'd resign right away. But I think before I resigned, I would get up on TV with a chalkboard, and I would explain to people what they need to know about the malinvestment and what has to be done. And I would warn them. I would say, okay, here's the situation. Here's the malinvestment. This is what's going on, what's been going on ever since the Federal Reserve was created. And what we're going to do is we're going to shake it out. We're going to stop printing money, and there's going to be a depression. So you have some time to get ready. And I would set a date, let's say in 1 year, just arbitrarily, that's off the top of my head, but I would set a date so they would know we're going to stop printing on that day. So get ready. Now, that's what happened to the economy in World War II. And I explain that in the article in the early warning report. There was a huge amount of malinvestment created by that war. The government converted all of America's heavy industry to producing tanks and planes and ships and all of this very heavy equipment. And then when the war was over, that was all malinvestment. There was no need for it. And so it all had to be shaken out. But everybody understood it. The man on the street realized there was going to be a shakeout. And the corporate CEOs understood it. The government understood it. They all realized there was going to be a shakeout of all of this malinvestment. So the government kept hands off. And this miracle happened. This what looked like was going to be another Great Depression turned out to be just what we would call today a minor recession. And unemployment only got up to 5.9%, and then just for 1 month, and then it came back down again. And all of this stuff was liquidated, and new businesses were created. There was this tremendous boom that followed it. It was all over with in, let's say, 6 to 9 months or so, and it wasn't anywhere near as bad as most people were afraid it was going to be.
That is an excellent point, Rick. I mean, that really, yes, that is cause for optimism. And it makes a lot of sense what you're saying, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you got to have somebody get up on TV and say, "This is the situation, people. We've got to just realize that we're going to have a bad few months here, and get ready for it." So, but as you say, these power junkies in D.C. They don't want to lose their power, but I think they wouldn't. That's a strange thing. I think that they would not end up hanging from lampposts if they just get up there and tell the truth. I mean, it's just, to me, it's a really obvious thing. You need somebody with some charisma, a guy who's good in front of a camera like Ronald Reagan was, who gets up there and just tells, let's say gives a 1 hour presentation and tells the people, this is what we're going to do because we're sitting on the Fed is 114 years old, something like that. More than 100 years of this monkeying with the money supply. We're going to stop that. And so this is what's going to happen. Be ready for it.
Well,
Rick, what do you think about, do you have any thoughts on how the supply and demand imbalances around the world are so extreme right now? And it's shocking to hear about energy shortages in China, and also, at the same time, we have, there's no gas at the pump apparently in some places in the UK, and there's a shortage of almost everything that one might want to get, from semiconductors to, I mean, boat parts. I don't know. You're waiting for something, Doug, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it's gonna take a long time. So, how is it possible that things got so off track? Do you have any thoughts around that? Like, everything seemed like it was basically in balance, although lots of debt in 2019. But now, 2 years later, there's a shortage of everything, shortage of people.
Yeah. Again, in that different article, in that early warning report for this month, you should look at the footnote where I talk about the Chinese government arranging for these shortages. This is a fascinating thing. In April, Industry Week magazine had an expert on China describe what he saw going on there, and he said, in April, look out, there's going to be a lot of shortages. They are going to make it a policy to deprioritize shipments to America and send the shipments elsewhere. And they are going to specifically do a sort of embargo against America. It'll be quiet, it'll be disguised, but there will be shortages of practically everything. That guy was absolutely right on the money. I mean, he just hit it on the head. And we're going through that now. And what I would point out is that, listening to Doug's idea here about what the next war is going to be, what you could be watching here is the beginning of the next war.
Well, I mean, that's Doug's talked about the idea of a hot war with China, being almost inevitable at some point. When you first said it to me, Doug, a couple of years ago, I thought I was surprised, but it seems more and more realistic by the day, honestly, because we are realizing we're so dependent on them for all of the basics that we need. And there's a lot of resentment that can be built up within our society, essentially directed at them if we're deprived of these things we feel like we need.
And another big danger, I think, is that when things get bad in this country, the state likes to blame the problems it's created on somebody else. It's the fault of those damned Arabs for charging too much or maybe too little for their oil. And, it's the fault of the Japanese for the Chinese. It's somebody else's fault, the problems that we have. And of course, that can spiral into a war. But I'm a little bit afraid of something that's going to resemble a civil war in this country, because don't you find that the red people and the blue people really hate each other at this point? I've never seen anything like this, even during the 60s and early 70s.
Yeah, I agree with you. Absolutely. The country has really fractured clearly between people who hate and fear the government and people who trust the government. And, the COVID-19 is, I think, just an example of that. I think you've got all these millions of people who are refusing to get the shots because they don't trust the government. And then there are a whole lot of people who, millions and millions and more, who believe what they were taught in school, that the government is their superhero and that it's some kind of saint or angel and it tells the truth. It's a religion, really. I mean, what's taught in the schools and the colleges is a religion. It teaches people how to have faith in the government. Well, look at history. Show me any government in history that was trustworthy. Just one. I wish somebody would show me one any time in history.
But they all believe in their governments. I mean, a lot of the Chinese still love and respect Mao. Mao's still on their currency, and a lot of the Russians still think that Stalin was the greatest thing that ever happened for them. And so it's almost like a genetic flaw that people experience. But, one thing that scares me the most is that when we were going to school, I didn't think there's a lot, there was a leftist professor here and there in college, nothing in high school nothing in grade school.
Hmm.
But now it seems like all of the teachers and professors are hardcore Marxists, socialists, collectivists of some type, either that or just dim. So the kids have been imprinted. Uh, it's pretty much like Ignatius Loyola, founder of the Jesuits, said, or for that matter, Lenin said the same thing. Maybe he cribbed it from Loyola. Give me a child until he's age 8, and I have him for the rest of his life. So
Hmm.
isn't this kind of a new ingredient in this stew that we're looking at now?
I wouldn't call it new, but you sure are right about what it is. Samantha and I, at one time long ago, were public school teachers. And, I was for 4 years and she was for 8 years. And we have experience in all grades, 12, or kindergarten to 12. And I can tell you, and then we're talking mid-70s here, the schools were already very, very socialist at that time, very statist, which is the better word, I think. And I think that, let's see, I had an idea there. The idea is gone, sorry. Maybe it'll come back. But anyhow, the schools were, at that time, heavily statist, and I was surrounded by teachers who just worshipped the government. They thought it was the solution to all problems. So what you see here today, in the minds of the millennials especially, but the other generations, is just a result of the fact that the teachers back then were had already been swept up by socialism. People don't realize that what was going on in education in America up until the 20th century was the one-room schoolhouse. Around 1900, there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000 one-room schoolhouses in America. And you didn't have these big factory model assembly line schools that we have today. It was just the one-room schoolhouse, and all ages went to that schoolhouse, and kids taught each other in the schoolhouse. The teacher was there and provided help wherever needed. But essentially, each kid was a tutor who taught other kids whatever needed to be taught. A kid who's, let's say, 14 and is very good at reading would teach a kid who is 7 who needed help with that. But there could be a kid who was 7 who was very good at math, and he would help a kid who was 14. So the whole school operated like a family, and the teacher was just there again and to oversee it and to take care of the kids. And an exercise everybody should do is look at do a search on the internet for eighth grade graduation test. And there's quite a few on there. The test you had to pass in the 1800s in order to get a 8th grade diploma. And you show me any college graduate today that would have an easy time with that test. There's just no way. And that'll show you how well those one-room schools worked. But the socialists hated them because each community was teaching the kids their own values and beliefs, and especially political beliefs. And the socialists wanted to create the new socialist man, where everybody would think like a socialist. And so they took over in the 20th century. They took over the schools and colleges. And that's why by the 1970s, pretty much all the teachers were a bunch of socialists, a bunch of statists. And, Samantha and I lived with that for a few years and couldn't take it any longer. And
I can see. And of course, in those days, how how could it possibly work? Because they didn't have layers and layers of highly paid administrators and professional educators on top of the fleet of teachers. I mean,
Right. Yeah, and there was a real depth to it back in the one-room schoolhouse days. You know, if the teacher was weak in some areas, which everybody is, you know, there would probably be a kid in the class who was better at it than the teacher was, and would be able to help the other kids. So, you know, even if the teacher got sick and was gone, the kids were still able to help each other. So, as I say, it was a family arrangement, and it had depth, and it passed along the American heritage. And boy, the socialists, the idea of a country full of rugged individualists just really drives the socialists nuts, because they got to prove that everybody's helpless and they need a big government to help them. So they really hated those schools with a passion, and by about 1920, most of them were gone.
Rick, what is the thing that makes you most optimistic today? And what would you say would be the thing that makes you most pessimistic at this point?
That is a really good question. Yes, most optimistic would be that the homeschooling movement, and in fact, Doug, I think you made that point in your article here in the last couple of days, that I noticed you put that first, and I would put that first too. The people are beginning to raise their children themselves, and that's a really big thing. And so many of those kids, I mean, really, I got to tell you, man, those kids, there's a lot of them that they are a new breed of human being, a lot different than anybody that you and I grew up with. I can remember, I used to give speeches at homeschooling conferences, and so I met a lot of these kids and their parents. And you know, the parents were really struggling. It's a hard work to raise your kid that way until you really get the hang of it, and then it's pretty easy. But the kids had a confidence and a maturity and social skills that are just unknown in schools today. Just, you know, a school today is just, you know, another point. Parents are told that when you are putting your kid in school, your kid is being raised by the teacher. Well, that's not true. Never was true. That teacher is spread so thin among however many kids they have, let's say, you know, 15 to 30 to 35. That teacher is spread so thin and has so much paperwork, so much red tape and meetings and other kind of things that they have to do, that they have almost no time at all one-on-one with your child. They do not get to know your child. And the kids around them, though, have lots of time to spend with your child, and they do get to know your child, and they get to know the child's weaknesses as well as strengths. And what happens is your child is raised by the other children. That's what goes on in a school. You people worry like crazy, and justifiably so, about their teenagers getting into all sorts of trouble and doing all sorts of terrible experimentations with drugs and other things. It's because your kids are being raised by the other kids, not by the teacher.
well, it almost sounds like a Lord of the Flies situation could develop, where your kid is surrounded by a bunch of other little yahoos that have all kinds of bad habits they picked up from wherever.
Yeah, that's exactly what's going on. Now, I wonder if the guy or whoever it was that wrote Lord of the Flies,
William Golding.
He realized that.
William Golding, yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if he realized that, and that was really the purpose of the book, is to show you this is what goes on.
Well, that'd be interesting to investigate, actually. I'd like to find out.
And I wonder, one of the things that I found interesting about this is when I was growing up, so I'm 46, but when I was in, and I went to public schools, the rare occasion that I would meet someone that was homeschooled, I remember thinking as I was growing up that they were weird, that they were different. But as I got older, what I realized is that they just didn't have the self-consciousness that is trained into you at going to schools, where basically, as you said, you're raised by your peer group and not by, not even having the advantage of kids that are older than you and younger than you in the mix, that I think actually creates a reasonable balance, because no 15-year-old is going to stand by while a big 6-year-old bullies a 5-year-old, so like that stuff doesn't happen when you put the kids together. So in any case, but I've just realized, it took me years to realize that what was weird about the homeschool kids was actually a reflection of my own deficiency, of my own self-consciousness, my own uncomfortable with myself, that these kids didn't seem to be burdened with.
That's very astute. I'm glad to hear that. Your ability to see that in yourself by itself is a real sign of good character. Most people would not. I think, I don't know. Where else do you want to go here?
Well, the homeschool trend, you said, is the most things that make you most optimistic, and I think that is that I agree. That's a hugely positive thing. And it's been almost, parents like me were almost forced to confront the fact that their kids had been receiving a substandard education all along because of the COVID stuff. So it's kind of pushed that, which is really positive. But what would you say on the other side makes you most pessimistic about the current state?
I gotta say, the fact that the government owns and controls all of the schools. Doug and I have had conversations about this over the years, and I keep coming back to the same thing. As long as the government, look at it this way: why is freedom of the press and freedom of speech in the Constitution? Why is it? Why are they the First Amendment? The First Amendment, and it's because we don't want the government controlling the flow of information and brainwashing the whole population. We want a free press. We want people to be able to think freely. Well, what good is that if you're sending your kid to these schools that the government owns and controls? And you can see that in the press. My God, the mainstream press just is clearly, judging what's going on in the world according to what they were taught in these government-controlled schools. So to me, those schools are absolutely poison. I mean, because the main lesson kids come out of there with is, no matter what your problem is, more government is the solution. And as long as they believe that, we have no hope. So I think that we need to somehow undermine the credibility of the government-controlled schools to the point that people are just completely fed up, and they're going to raise their kids themselves. Now, maybe most of them won't be able to do that because they're already paying very heavy taxes to the government-controlled schools. They're forced to buy government education, and having to keep one parent at home, let's say, while only one works outside the home, that's a really big problem for a lot of people. But I think there's probably maybe a third of the population that could do it, and so there needs to be an effort to convince those people that their kids will be a lot better off if they're raised by somebody who loves them rather than by the mob at school.
Right. Yeah. And I think it has been revealed to be true, I think, to a lot of parents like myself, that it's not even just that they'll be better off. It's that you are permanently damaging your children if you leave them in that steady state. I mean, you're just destroying them.
Yeah, both of you, and I bet every one of our listeners here has known people who did not finally overcome the emotional problems they got in school until they were in their 40s or 50s. And some people never do. That's how much damage it does. That peer pressure, that's kind of my hot button. The peer pressure is just something that a kid is not equipped to deal with. Most adults, if you had, you think about it, some kid walks into the classroom and for one reason or another stumbles and drops a book, and everybody laughs. Well, can you imagine as an adult having a bunch of your friends ridiculing you like that? But that is a common sort of thing in schools. You're going to get ridiculed for anything you do that's out of the ordinary. And that all by itself, I think, follows people for most of their lives.
That's an excellent point. It really is. I mean, I always like to point to that movie that Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito made. Twins, where Arnold is brought up on a desert island, basically, and Danny DeVito was brought up in New York City schools. And, it kind of underlines what we're talking about.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen the movie, but I can imagine how that went. Yeah.
Well, Rick, what's the best way that people can find you and find your work?
Let's see. We got a website, which is richardmaybury.com. And my last name is spelled Maybury. And our newsletter is called U.S. and World Early Warning Report. Let's see. Also, 800 number. That's 800-509-5400. And that should do it. Right now, I believe that there's a special offer on the website for a discount, a sizable discount on the newsletter subscription. So I would suggest, if you're interested, you take a look at that.
And I just want to add to that. I think that if you're interested in a deep historical perspective on what's happening today and how to invest appropriately today, that I think that this newsletter is as good as any out there, and honestly, deeply underpriced for what you get from it.
Yeah, it really is. And on top of, and I underline everything that Matt said, plus I say it's an enjoyable read. I look forward to it every month.
I do too.
Well,
and,
thank you, Doug.
It gets passed around my house, and everybody takes a turn reading it. So strongly encourage everyone to check it out. Also, Rick's Uncle Eric books are tremendous, and I assume they can find those on your website as well.
That's right. Yeah. There's 11 Uncle Eric books, and I just suggest you read them in sequence. The first one is about financial security. That's the title, but it is much more important. Is I show that in order to understand what's going on in the world, you have to know how to think, which the schools don't teach. And that first book is mostly devoted to how to think, how to create paradigms that enable you to understand what's really going on in the world. And then I go on to the financial ramifications of that. And that one, and then the next one is called Whatever Happened to Penny Candy, which is it's written. Well, all of these books are written so that you have the sense. What's going on is a young person has an uncle who is an economist and starts asking questions, and they correspond with each other. And the child asks questions, the economist answers them, and you are reading over the shoulder of the young person who's getting these answers. so it's all written very simply, very easy to understand, and that, I think, is why they're so popular. Is you have that sense of the explanations being easy to absorb, and yet you don't have the sense that somebody's talking down to you. So that's really what makes them work. And what the books essentially do is give you what the schools no longer do. A whole lot of history and all sorts of other subjects, law, economics, finance, all of this stuff that the schools don't teach. So that's, there's, I could go on for all day.
Yeah.
So
I just strongly encourage people to pick up those books and read them. They're, even the one on World War I and World War II were fascinating. So there's lots of good stuff. Well, Rick, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it. And I'll have a link to this to your website and where people can subscribe to your newsletter in the description of this video. I strongly encourage everybody to go and subscribe.
Thank you, gentlemen. Again, you're doing a great job. Please keep it up. I really am glad you're there.
Well, it's such a pleasure talking to you. We'll have to do it at least once a year.
Okay. Well, I could be available once a month, I guess, if you want. It's up to you.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense to have you on because your historical perspective is really, really useful.
Yeah.
So thank you, Rick. Really appreciate it. And we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Rick.
Thank you, Matt and Doug.